They've never met someone like you, and I need you to understand what that actually means. Because it's not a compliment designed to make you feel better. It's a psychological explanation for why the connection felt so intense and why their behavior felt so confusing. Most people think avoidants pull away because they don't care, because they're cold, because they're selfish, because they're heartless. But what's often true is simpler and more painful. They pull away because something about you made closeness feel real, and real is the one thing their nervous system doesn't know how to hold without panicking. You weren't just attractive to them. You weren't just interesting. You weren't just nice. You were present in a way that bypassed the usual defenses. You looked at them and actually saw them. You listened in a way that didn't feel like a transaction. You had warmth that didn't demand performance. You offered safety without trying to control. And for a person with avoidant wiring, that kind of presence doesn't register as comfort first. It registers as exposure first. Because the moment someone truly sees them, the part of them that has survived through distance starts whispering, "This is dangerous. This is how I get trapped. This is how I lose control. This is how I get hurt. This is how I get expected to show up emotionally in a way I don't know how to sustain." That's why an avoidant can be deeply drawn to you and deeply afraid of you at the same time. Their attraction is real, but their fear is also real. And the reason you feel this pull is because avoidant attachment isn't a lack of feeling. It's a survival strategy around feeling. It's a nervous system that learned early, sometimes without anyone ever saying it out loud, that needing people is risky, that closeness comes with disappointment, that dependence leads to pain, that emotions create chaos, so distance became the way they stayed safe. They may not consciously remember learning that, but their body remembers it. So when you come along and you make closeness feel meaningful, not just exciting, not just fun, but meaningful, it triggers something bigger than romance. It triggers the fear of being known. It triggers the fear of failing you. It triggers the fear of being responsible for someone else's heart. It triggers the fear that if they let this in fully, they won't be able to shut it off later. And that fear can be so uncomfortable that their mind starts doing what it has always done. It tries to regain control by creating space. This is why they can have an incredible day with you, and then go quiet after. This is why they can be warm and connected in the moment, and then distant the next. Because the moment of closeness happens when they're with you, when they can feel the warmth, but afterwards, when they're alone, their nervous system starts replaying it like a threat assessment. The mind starts scanning. What did I reveal? What did they see? What will they expect now? Did I come on too strong? Did I promise something? Are they going to want more from me? And the safest way to quiet that internal alarm is to pull back. And here's the part that matters most for you, because it will change how you interpret their behavior. When they pull back, you might assume you did something wrong. You might assume you were too emotional, too available, too invested, too honest, too deep. But often, you were simply too real for someone who has built their identity around being unaffected. Your presence challenged the story they tell themselves, the story that they don't need anyone, that they're fine alone, that attachment is weakness. You made it harder for them to pretend they're untouched. And that's why they haven't met someone like you, because most people either chase them in a way that confirms their fear, or they stay shallow enough that the avoidant never has to confront intimacy. You did neither. You brought depth without chaos. You brought closeness without losing your dignity, at least at first. And that combination is rare. But let's be honest, rare is not always rewarded in avoidant dynamics. Rare can be frightening. Rare can create pressure. Rare can create a sense of, if I lose this, it will matter, and if it matters, it can hurt. So they may try to minimize you, not because you are small, but because your importance makes them feel vulnerable. They may label you as too intense, too serious, too emotional, because labels shrink the feeling. Labels give them a reason to retreat without admitting fear. Labels make it your fault instead of their nervous system's limitation. And if you've been waiting for the moment they finally realize what you were, I need you to remember this. They may already know. They may already feel it. They may already sense that you're different. The problem is not recognition. The problem is capacity. It takes capacity to hold a rare kind of connection without running from it. It takes maturity to stay when closeness rises. It takes courage to face the parts of themselves your presence awakens. So yes, they may never have met someone like you, and that's exactly why you felt unforgettable to them. But it's also why you may have felt impossible to keep, because you were asking their nervous system to do something it has never learned to do. Stay. Avoidants don't stop feeling. They stop admitting what they feel. And this is one of the most important truths you can understand if you've ever loved someone who seemed warm one day and unreachable the next. Most people assume that an avoidance distance means absence of emotion, But in many cases it means the opposite. It means emotion has risen high enough that their nervous system is trying to shut it down. They don't go cold because nothing is happening inside. They go cold because too much is happening inside, and they don't have a safe pathway to express it without feeling exposed, obligated, or out of control. An avoidant person can feel a deep pull toward you and still act indifferent. They can miss you and still delay replying. They can want you and still create space. And the reason this is so confusing is because you are expecting emotion to translate into behavior in a straightforward way. In secure love, it often does. When secure people care, they lean in. When they miss you, they reach. When they feel closeness, they deepen it. But avoidant attachment is built differently. Avoidants experience closeness as pressure before they experience it as comfort, and pressure activates their survival strategy, which is distance. Pressure doesn't always mean you pressured them. Sometimes the pressure is simply the reality of intimacy. Intimacy naturally comes with expectation, not demands, not control, just expectation, the expectation that you will matter to each other, that you will show up, that you will be consistent, that you will communicate, that your choices will affect someone. For someone with avoidant wiring, that basic expectation can feel heavy, because their nervous system learned to equate emotional responsibility with risk. They may have grown up in an environment where emotions were unpredictable, where closeness came with criticism, or where needs were dismissed. So they learned to rely on themselves, to minimize dependence, to stay in control. That became their identity. And when you arrive and create real connection, it threatens that identity. So when they start feeling something genuine for you, their mind starts doing a strange thing. It turns the feeling into a problem to manage. They think, what does this mean? Where is this going? What will they want from me? What if I can't meet it? What if I disappoint them? What if I lose my freedom? What if I get trapped? What if I get hurt? Those questions aren't romance, they're threat assessment. They are the avoidant mind trying to protect the avoidant body from vulnerability. And when that threat assessment gets loud, they withdraw. They pause, they go quiet. They slow down the connection. They create space so their nervous system can calm. But here's the tragedy, the very thing that could soothe them, secure connection, is the thing they fear most. That's why avoidant dynamics can feel like you're always almost there. You get a glimpse of their softness, their warmth, their attention, and then it disappears. Because the moment closeness rises, they feel the pressure of being emotionally responsible. They don't just feel love, they feel the possibility of being needed, and being needed triggers their fear of failing. And fear of failing triggers shame. And shame is unbearable for people who learn to survive by looking like they don't need anyone. This is why avoidants often express love indirectly. They might do acts of service instead of words. They might show up physically but avoid emotional conversations. They might flirt, tease, be playful, but shut down when you ask for clarity. They might be amazing in the moment and absent in between. It's not always because they don't care. It's because direct emotional language feels like a loss of control. Saying, I miss you, makes the feeling real. Saying, I want you, makes the stakes real. Saying, I'm afraid to lose you, makes them vulnerable. So they keep it contained. They keep it implied. They keep it hidden behind casualness. And here's where you need to protect yourself, because hidden emotion can create a fantasy. You start thinking if they feel all this underneath, then surely they will change. Surely they will show up. Surely they will come around. But emotion underneath does not automatically create a stable relationship. An avoidant can have deep feelings and still not have the capacity to communicate consistently, to tolerate conflict, to repair, to stay present when intimacy intensifies. Feelings are not the issue. The issue is the nervous system's tolerance for closeness. That's why the phrase, love registers as pressure first, is so important. When they feel close, their body doesn't relax, it braces. When they sense you care, they don't always feel cherished. They feel watched. When they notice you're attached, they don't always feel chosen, they feel responsible. And responsibility for them can feel like a cage. So they pull away to breathe. And you, because you are reading behavior, interpret that pull away as rejection, and you chase, and chasing increases pressure, and pressure increases distance. And now you've built a loop that hurts both of you. So what do you do with this truth? You stop trying to prove your worth through more effort. You stop believing that if you love harder, they will feel safer. Safety is not created by your sacrifice. Safety is created by consistency, clarity, and emotional maturity, and that has to come from them. You can be warm, you can be steady, you can be grounded, but you cannot love someone out of a nervous system that panics at intimacy. And if you're watching this hoping for the simplest answer, here it is. If they stop admitting what they feel, don't try to drag the feelings out of them. Watch what they build. Watch what they repair. Watch whether their behavior can hold the weight of the emotion you sense underneath. Because hidden feelings can be real, but only visible behavior can keep your heart safe. They pulled back right after things felt good, and if you've lived through that, you know how disorienting it is. You're not talking about a relationship that was obviously toxic or constantly chaotic. You're talking about those moments that felt real, the laughter, the eye contact, the softness, the sense that something meaningful was forming, and then suddenly silence, a delay, a shift in tone, a distancing that makes you question your own reality. And your mind starts doing the painful math. If it was good, why would they pull away? If they felt it too, why would they retreat? If they cared, why would closeness create distance? The answer isn't always that they didn't enjoy it. The answer is often that the good moment created intimacy, and intimacy activates the avoidant alarm system. Avoidance can be wonderful in the moment because the moment feels contained. The moment feels like connection without long-term consequence. They can be affectionate, attentive, even deeply open, because while they're with you they can ride the warmth. But when the moment ends, their nervous system starts recalculating. The warmth becomes a question. The closeness becomes a threat assessment. And what they enjoyed becomes something they suddenly feel they have to manage. That's why you'll often see an avoidant withdraw after a peak moment, after a weekend together, after a vulnerable conversation, after a deep emotional bond, after a first big, this feels special. It's not always because you said the wrong thing. Sometimes you said the right thing. Sometimes you were the right thing. And the right thing is scary when your nervous system has learned that closeness leads to pressure, expectation, or disappointment. In their body, closeness can translate into a future they feel unprepared to sustain. Their mind starts asking questions like, what does this mean now? Will they want more? Will I have to show up consistently? Will I be expected to communicate more? Will I have to be emotionally available? Will I lose my freedom? Will I disappoint them? Will they see my flaws? Will they demand a version of me I'm not sure I can be? Those questions don't come from logic alone. They come from a nervous system that equates intimacy with responsibility and responsibility with danger. So they do what has worked for them their whole life. They create space to lower the internal pressure. Space gives them control. Space reduces the sensations they don't know how to regulate. Space lets them return to the identity that feels safe, the independent one, the self-contained one, the one who doesn't need. And because they feel calmer after taking space, they interpret that calmness as proof that space was necessary. They tell themselves, see, I'm better when I'm not so close, see. This is why I need distance, see. This is why relationships get complicated. But what they're feeling isn't necessarily truth, it's nervous system relief. This is also why you can feel like you were punished for closeness. You give love, you give softness, you give connection, and it's followed by withdrawal. And if you're not careful, you start adjusting yourself to avoid triggering their retreat. You become smaller. You become quieter. You become more chill. You delay your needs. You swallow questions. You try to be the easiest person to love. But what you're really doing is teaching yourself that intimacy costs you safety, and that is a heartbreaking lesson to learn in a relationship. Here is the deeper layer, the part most people miss. When you are emotionally present, you become a mirror, and avoidants don't always like what intimacy shows them. Intimacy reflects their inconsistency. It reflects their fear. It reflects their unmet emotional skills. It reflects the parts of them that want connection but don't know how to maintain it. You may not even be asking them to change, but your presence highlights what would need to change for a stable relationship to exist. And that can create a silent shame. They can enjoy you, and at the same time feel inadequate. They can feel cared for, and at the same time fear they can't reciprocate in the way you deserve. So they pull back, not always because you are too much, but because closeness makes them confront the gap between what they can give and what you might require. Another reason they pull back after a good moment is because good moments increase stakes. When a connection is casual, it feels low risk. When it becomes meaningful, the risk of loss rises. And for avoidance, loss is not only the loss of the person, it's the loss of control, the loss of autonomy, the loss of emotional superiority, the loss of the story that they are fine alone. The more they like you, the more vulnerable they become. And vulnerability is the very place they've trained themselves to avoid. So they withdraw to regain the upper hand, to return to emotional neutrality, to feel safe again. This explains why your chasing often makes it worse. When they pull back, you feel anxious, you reach, you ask, you want clarity. That's normal. But your reaching increases the pressure they already feel, and their system responds by pulling back more, so the loop strengthens. You lean in to feel safe, they lean out to feel safe. Both of you are seeking safety in opposite directions. The way out of this isn't to become colder. It's to become grounded. If they pull back after closeness, you don't punish them. But you don't overcompensate either. You don't chase the peak moment like it's proof. You observe what happens after the peak moment, because that is the real relationship. Anyone can be present when it feels good. The question is, can they stay present when it starts to mean something? Can they handle the normal expectations of intimacy without shutting down? Can they communicate through the discomfort instead of escaping it? Because the relationship is not built in the highs, it's built in the follow-through. And that is where avoidant patterns either evolve or repeat. Sometimes the story you've been telling yourself is the one that keeps you trapped. The story that says they pulled away because you were too much, too emotional, too intense, too available, too invested, too deep. And I understand why you tell yourself that story, because it gives you a sense of control. If you were too much, then you can become less. If you made a mistake, you can fix it. If you said the wrong thing, you can rewrite it. That story hurts, but it also seduces you with hope, because it suggests that if you adjust yourself correctly, they will finally stay. But the hidden truth, the one that almost nobody talks about, is that sometimes they didn't pull away because you were too much, they pulled away because you became a standard. And that standard frightened them. You represented a kind of love that requires someone to show up. You represented consistency. You represented emotional honesty. You represented the possibility of a relationship that doesn't run on ambiguity. And for an avoidant, ambiguity is comfort. Ambiguity gives them room to breathe, room to disappear, room to return, room to stay half in, half out. Your presence, especially if you are emotionally grounded, makes that half-life harder to maintain. When you become a standard, you become a mirror. A mirror doesn't judge, it simply reflects. And intimacy with you may have reflected things they didn't want to face. Their inconsistency, their fear of vulnerability, their avoidance of difficult conversations, their habit of withdrawing instead of repairing. You didn't have to accuse them. You didn't have to pressure them. You might have simply been steady, simply honest, simply clear about what you want. And clarity can feel like pressure to an avoidant nervous system, because clarity removes escape routes. Clarity says, we either build something or we don't. Clarity says, actions matter. Clarity says, love is not just feelings, it's behavior. And that makes an avoidant confront the question they are terrified of, can I actually meet this? This is the part that can break your heart if you don't see it, because you may have felt their admiration. You may have felt how they looked at you when you spoke from your values. You may have felt the softness they showed when you were gentle. You may have sensed that they knew you were rare. And yet, they still pulled away. That's because admiration and capacity are not the same thing. They can admire you and still not be ready for the level of emotional presence you naturally bring. They can desire you and still fear what desire will demand from them long term. They can want you and still be terrified of failing you. Avoidants often carry a quiet belief that if they get close, they will eventually disappoint you. They may not say it, because it feels shameful, but it lives underneath their distancing. When they meet someone who is emotionally mature, someone who is consistent, someone who values real connection, it can awaken that shame. It can make them feel exposed, not because you are criticizing them, but because your stability highlights their instability. Your clarity highlights their avoidance. Your willingness to communicate highlights their habit of shutting down. So instead of leaning in to grow, they pull away to protect themselves from the feeling of inadequacy. And here is where it gets even more complicated. Some avoidants don't just fear being hurt. They fear being held to a standard they cannot maintain. They fear being expected to communicate consistently. They fear being expected to show up when things are hard. They fear being expected to repair after conflict instead of disappearing. And because they fear failing at those things, they often choose the illusion of control over the risk of intimacy. They would rather distance and tell themselves they're independent than stay and risk discovering they're not emotionally equipped. So the way they protect themselves is by shrinking you in their mind. They might label you as too serious, or too needy, or too intense, because those labels make your standard feel unreasonable. Those labels allow them to retreat without facing their own limitations. It's a psychological maneuver that turns their fear into your flaw. And when you accept that label, you start doing their work for them. You start doubting your needs. You start apologizing for wanting closeness. You start making your standards smaller so they feel less overwhelmed. But all that does is train the relationship to survive on your self-abandonment. If you're hearing this and feeling a tightness in your chest, it's because part of you recognizes it. You weren't asking for perfection. You were asking for participation. You weren't demanding constant attention. You were asking for consistency. You weren't trying to trap them. You were trying to build something real. And that's why you became a standard. Your presence came with a quiet message that said, love has to be lived, not just felt. And that message can be terrifying to someone who has learned to avoid the very practices that create stable love. So what do you do with this truth? You stop lowering yourself to be easier to keep. You stop framing your needs as too much. You stop begging someone to meet a standard that is actually normal in healthy love. Because if your clarity scares them, that doesn't make your clarity wrong. It means your clarity is revealing what they can and cannot hold. And that revelation is painful, but it is also freedom, because it saves you from spending your life trying to convince someone that you deserve what you already deserve. They may try to replace you fast, and if you've seen that, it can feel like a punch to the stomach, because it looks like proof that you weren't special, that the connection was shallow, that you were easy to move on from. Your mind starts spiraling. Were they ever real with me? Did I mean anything? Did they just use me? How can someone act so fine? But this is one of the biggest illusions in avoidant psychology. The illusion that speed equals healing. The illusion that a new person equals a new chapter. The illusion that moving on quickly means they didn't care. Sometimes what it actually means is that you became inconveniently unforgettable, and the fastest way for an avoidant to quiet the feeling of you is to cover it with noise. Avoidants often confuse relief with recovery. When a relationship becomes emotionally meaningful, it can activate their fear of responsibility, their fear of being needed, their fear of failing someone, and when they pull away they feel a rush of relief. That relief feels like clarity. It feels like peace. And in that early stage, they may genuinely believe the relationship was the problem, because their nervous system calmed down when distance appeared. So they reach for what keeps them calm. They reach for distraction. They reach for novelty. They reach for a connection that feels lighter, less intimate, less demanding. They choose someone who doesn't mirror them, someone who doesn't activate their deeper attachment system, someone who doesn't call them into maturity. This is why a replacement is often not about you at all. It's about regulation. It's about the avoidant using a new dynamic to keep their nervous system from confronting the loss. It's about choosing chemistry over closeness, excitement over intimacy, attention over accountability. And the cruel part is, from the outside it looks like they're thriving. They post, they laugh, they show up as if nothing happened. But often what you're seeing is not their heart being healed, it's their fear being soothed. Because a truly meaningful connection leaves residue. It leaves memory. It leaves contrast. It leaves a before and after. And you created contrast. You created a standard. You created depth. So when they try to replace you, what they're often doing is attempting to overwrite that contrast. They are trying to convince themselves they're fine without you by proving they can still be wanted. They are trying to prove they're not affected by loss. They are trying to regain power, because for an avoidant, being unaffected is a form of safety. If they can stay fine, they don't have to feel vulnerable. If they can move on quickly, they don't have to face the discomfort of missing. If they can be chosen by someone new, they don't have to confront the shame of what they couldn't sustain with you. But here's where the illusion breaks. Relief doesn't nourish. Relief calms the nervous system, but it doesn't feed the heart. It creates quiet, but it doesn't create depth. And over time, relief becomes hollow. The new connection might feel exciting, but it often lacks the resonance you brought. It might be easy, but easy is not always meaningful. It might be light, but light doesn't always satisfy. And that's when the memory of you can return in a stubborn way, not always as longing, sometimes as discomfort, sometimes as comparison, sometimes as the quiet realization that what they had with you was rare, and what they ran to is simply available. This is why avoidants sometimes return after a rebound fails, or after the novelty fades, or after they realize the new person doesn't touch them the way you did. Not because they are suddenly mature, but because the distraction stopped working. The thing they used to avoid feeling the loss wore off. And when it wears off, they are left with the unfinished emotional reality. The fact that you mattered more than their defenses wanted to admit. Now I want to be very careful here, because it's easy to turn this into a fantasy. The fantasy that they will come back because no one compares. That might happen, but it is not the goal you should build your life around. Because the most important truth is this: being irreplaceable doesn't guarantee being chosen well. They can miss your depth and still avoid the responsibility of depth. They can realize you were rare and still not have the capacity to love you consistently. They can regret losing you and still repeat the same pattern if they haven't done the internal work to change. So if you see them replace you quickly, don't let it rewrite your worth. Don't interpret it as evidence that you weren't enough. Often it's evidence that the connection was too real for their coping style, and they needed noise to escape the silence you left behind. Your job is not to compete with their distractions. Your job is to return to yourself. Because the person who can replace someone quickly is not necessarily the person who is healed. It's often the person who is afraid to be alone with their own feelings. And if you're tempted to chase, to prove, to show them what they lost, Remember this: you don't need to prove your value to someone who runs from value. You don't need to fight to be chosen by someone who chooses relief over growth. You don't need to shrink your standards because they found someone who asks for less. Someone who asks for less is not a prize. You are not losing to them. You are being spared the role of emotional caretaker in a relationship that would have required you to carry the weight of two people's intimacy. You are not replaceable in the way your fear suggests. You are simply the kind of connection that asks a person to grow, and if they choose distraction instead, that doesn't make you less. It reveals what they are not ready to hold. Being rare in their mind isn't the goal. Being safe in someone's hands is, and this is the line that separates a life spent waiting from a life spent living. Because the most seductive trap in an avoidant story is the fantasy of impact. You want to know you mattered. You want to know they think about you. You want to know they compare others to you. You want to know they regret. You want to know they've never met anyone like you. And those desires are human. They're not shallow. They're your heart looking for closure. But if you build your self-worth on being unforgettable, you can end up accepting a relationship where you are never fully chosen, only periodically remembered. Unforgettable can be painful. Unforgettable can mean you live in someone's head while your needs go unmet in real life. Unforgettable can mean you're the person they miss at night and neglect during the day. Unforgettable can mean you become a lesson instead of a partner. And I need you to hear this clearly. You do not heal by becoming someone's regret. You heal by becoming your own priority. You heal by choosing relationships where love shows up as stability, not as delayed realization. Avoidant people can genuinely recognize your value and still not have the capacity to love you in a way that protects you. This is the part that breaks people, because it feels unfair. You think, if they see it, why can't they just do it? If they miss me, why can't they show up? If they're thinking of me, why can't they commit? But recognition is not readiness. Longing is not leadership. Regret is not repair. And if you make their internal emotions the evidence that your future will be different, you will keep reopening the same wound. So the payoff is not about winning their attention. The payoff is about upgrading your standards so your nervous system stops living on crumbs. Your standard becomes simple. If someone wants access to you, they must show up with consistency. If someone wants intimacy with you, they must be willing to communicate. If someone wants a relationship with you, they must be willing to repair. Not perfectly, not like a robot, but like an adult who can stay present when things get real. Because love is not the highlight reel. Love is follow-through. Love is what happens after the apology. Love is what happens after the romantic moment. Love is what happens when you have needs, when you're tired, when you're anxious, when life is messy. That's where safety is proven. And this is why if they ever return, the most powerful thing you can do is not to melt, not to punish, not to audition, not to lecture, but to observe. Observe how they handle clarity. Observe whether they can tolerate a real conversation without shutting down. Observe whether they can name what happened without blaming you for feeling. Observe whether they can make a plan and actually follow it. Observe how they respond when you don't immediately give them full access. Because a person who is genuinely ready will respect your pace. They will understand your caution. They will accept that trust is rebuilt through behavior. Someone who is not ready will become frustrated when you don't instantly reset. They'll want the benefits of reconnection without the work of repair. They'll say things like, "Why are you bringing up the past?" Or, "Can't we just move forward?" But moving forward without accountability is not moving forward. It's burying the same fracture under fresh paint. And your heart knows the difference. Your nervous system knows the difference. It tightens when you're about to repeat the pattern. So your job is to stop confusing intensity with intimacy. Avoidant dynamics often have intensity, the longing, the distance, the dramatic returns, the silence that makes your heart race. But intensity is not intimacy. Intimacy is steady. Intimacy is safe. Intimacy is calm. It's the ability to be close without fear. It's the ability to talk without punishment. It's the ability to disagree without disappearing. If you grew up associating love with uncertainty, you may have learned to mistake intensity for depth. This is your chance to rewire that. Your chance to let calm be attractive. Your chance to let consistency be your new chemistry. Being safe in someone's hands means you don't have to decode. You don't have to chase. You don't have to wait for someone's mood to decide your worth. You don't have to explain your needs like you're apologizing. You don't have to shrink to keep someone from running. You can be fully human. You can have feelings, you can ask questions, you can want closeness, and the relationship doesn't punish you for it. So yes, they may have never met someone like you. They may think about you for years. They may feel the loss in ways they never confess. But your life is not a museum where you collect proof that you were valuable. Your life is a home, and only people who can treat you with care get to live there. The final payoff is choosing a love that doesn't require you to be unforgettable to be respected. It requires you to be respected because you exist. And when you finally accept that, you stop chasing the story, and you start living the standard.